Hi, and welcome to the Cornelius Seed Podcast. Thank you for checking out our podcast. Established in 1935, we're an American-owned and family-owned independent seed company. And we're excited to partner with you in our new podcast by bringing you 5 generations of agricultural experience and decades of industry expertise. In our podcasts, you can expect to gain valuable and timely information to aid you in making decisions for your operation. We'll keep things simple and informative, and much like our motto, Planet Profit. Hi, and thanks for joining us. In today's episode, we're going to play audio from one of the sessions at our Partner to Profit post-harvest grower meeting. This meeting was hosted at 3 locations across Cornelius Country. Cornelius Seed Lead Agronomist Craig Allaman shares what we learned from the 2022 growing season and how we can use that to prepare for 2023. Craig also covers a variety of topics from tar spot, fungicide application timing, planting dates, and so much more. So let's go ahead and jump into the audio and listen in.
So I'm going to go ahead, and my discussion this time of the year is usually based on what happened during the previous growing season. And when we talk about this, it's always interesting, but what we want to do is try to learn things from this year that we can apply to next year and hopefully make some more bushels, improve things in our production practices. So if you guys have questions as we go through when we're on a certain topic, just yell it out, raise your hand, whatever. We'll have questions at the end, of course. But if you want to cover some more things in depth as we're going through, feel free. Okay, so first thing I'm going to start talking about is edge effect in corn. Who here has heard about edge effect? Okay, yeah, we're kind of in the epicenter where Iowa State started to try to figure this out a few years ago. Of course, probably had it forever. There's no reason why we wouldn't have, but when we get yield monitors and these nice pretty maps that we get to look at, and we get time to say, hey, what the heck's going on the outside of my field, we can kind of dig into things a little bit more. We would probably blame that in the past, edge effect, on drift from other fields or weed pressure on the outside, or maybe it's compaction from where we load in the field. But it turns out there's some more things going on. So what edge effect is depressed yields on the outside of fields, and normally it's going to be on the south or the west side of the fields, okay? That's kind of what makes it different or points to it being the edge effects. And then on the fields that are on the south or the west side of the cornfields, they're going to probably either be a soybean field or possibly a hay field, okay? That's going to be kind of the determining factor there. It's going to be more prevalent. It's going to show up, maybe get further into the fields in drought years, okay? So how does it occur? Corn respires, okay? That's part of the photosynthesis process in corn, which is a grass, so other grasses are going to do this as well. That's why we see this edge effect coming out of soybeans, a legume, or hay, and not another grass crop. So in that respiration process, the corn plant is letting off moisture. That's what gives us our wonderful Midwest summer humidity, for the most part, is all that moisture coming off of all these acres of corn that we plant. It's also the way the corn plant helps to cool itself during that part of the growing season. If it doesn't have that cooling process, it gets too hot, it really hurts things during the grain fill period. So the air that passes over the cornfield picks up that moisture, but the air that comes over a soybean field or a hay field next to a cornfield is not doing that same thing. It's not picking up that kind of moisture. In fact, it's drying out. So if you had those warm, dry airs coming across those bean fields and then hitting that cornfield, and of course in the summer, we're going to have prevalent westerly winds, southwesterly winds in the summer. So that's why we usually see it on the south and the west side of the fields. Iowa State has done a lot of studies on this in 2019 and 2020. It averaged between 35 and 70 bushel yield depression there where this edge effect really occurred. So it can be a pretty big yield hit. We have started to see it in neighboring states, or maybe we're really just kind of looking at it. So this is kind of proof here that it's over in Illinois. And this field just happened to have soybeans planted all the way around it. So on each side of this field, there was a soybean field. So we can really see what this edge effect does. Now, not overly droughty situations this year, so it didn't get into the field a lot, but you can see here on the south side of the field, you can see that edge effect on the yield monitor, and also on the west, or here's the south and this is the west. But then on this east side of the field, you can see we didn't have that at all. So that really shows that edge effect. And then this is north and west of here, a little more dramatic, a little drier conditions, of course, as you guys know from this summer. This is a sandy type soil anyway. This is cornfield here, soybeans here. Now we're getting something here against this cornfield, and I don't know enough about the history of this field to know, but we probably got a soil type issue all along here. But it's drastically different when that wind's coming off of that soybean field. It's getting way, way out there into that field. So this is real. You know, there's maybe not a lot you can do with it, but there potentially is. If you want to get your rotation married up to this field right here, you know, potentially you could get away from some of those issues. If this was corn over here versus soybeans. Okay, moving on to corn fungicides. So my opinion on corn fungicides is a fungicide application to your corn is going to pay every time. Okay, that's my personal opinion. Looking at corn fungicides and what they've brought to us, the value they've brought to us through the years, and particularly in the atmosphere we're in, we're going to really talk about tar spot here in a minute, but it really plays into that tar spot. We got to get caught up in our ratings. You know what I get the question a lot of times is this hybrid going to react well to a fungicide? My response usually is all hybrids are going to react well to a fungicide. Okay, we can talk about, does this have good tolerance for this specific disease that you may have, and that's a valid question. Okay, if you're still going to scout, if you really need to protect against gray leaf, you know, we can go with one hybrid over the other. But in reality, I believe that fungicides will bring you value on every acre, every year, okay? And this is what it's going to bring. It's going to bring three main things in my estimation. But on yield, okay, so we're putting a fungicide on, at, generally speaking, at R1. That is the time frame when we get, on average, the highest yield with our fungicide application. Now, we can put it on early and R1. We can put it on late. We can do split shots. I understand there's a lot of things we can do, but if we're going out one time, R1 is that time frame. So why is that? Why is R1 the best time frame for it? So we think about what we're doing with these fungicides. We're putting on, there's a lot of different fungicides out there, but in general, we're going to have a strobilurin. Okay, that's going to be part of the package every time. We're probably going to have a triazole. These new longer residual type products, this SDHI family is the new family of fungicides that we're getting into. It's getting us a lot longer control. But the strobe portion that we're putting on there is a stress reliever for that plant. Okay? And so that's really the key, I think, when we're talking about that timing. And why is R1 the best time frame? Okay, so just think about what's going on. At R1, that's silking. Okay, so we've tasseled, and we're shooting silks, we're pollinating the plant. So it's also, generally speaking, going to be pretty warm, sometimes a dry period of the summer. But we need to have stress relief in that plant. That plant needs to be relaxed and doing its thing on pollination and starting the kernels. Okay, because in the pollination time frame, we need to not abort those kernels. We need to pollinate that entire ear, get that tip completely pollinated. And we need to not abort those kernels back after they pollinate on the tip. And then the second thing is that first couple of weeks after pollination is huge for our kernel depth, okay? And I think that's really, really important why we're getting the top end yield out of these fungicides, whether there's a disease present or not, okay? It's getting that extra kernel depth. And when we talk about how a corn plant flexes, I mean, we all know about rows around, length of the year, things like that. But a lot of the flex in these modern hybrids, and when we get these really, really high, 280 bushel whole field yields, our kernel depth is incredible. Okay, the length of those kernels, the depth that we're getting from them, and then the weight that we're able to pack in them. And I think this is key to that. Also, is going to increase harvestable ears by having better standability, having those ears be able to get into the combine later on, and then increase the photosynthesis during that grain fill period. We need to be producing carbohydrates, sticking that into the starch, into the ears, okay, and so we need green surface to be able to do that. So that's how we're getting yield from this fungicide applications. Disease control. We know the diseases we're going after, the importance of that, whether it's gray leaf, northern, or now tar spot. But we also decrease the anthracnose stalk rot with a fungicide application. Now, it won't control anthracnose by itself, but making that corn plant healthier, that plant is able to fight off anthracnose on its own. That was some of the early advantages that the universities discovered in these fungicide trials. So we will increase that, that control very well. But then I think key here as we talk about tar spot, you guys are just getting it new. I've been working with tar and looking at tar since it started, 2015, whatever that year was. And so I probably know as much as anybody, which means not a lot. Okay, we know what we know now. It's a new disease. Nobody should pretend they're an expert in it, but I'm happy to bring you what I have learned with it. In some cases through personal experience that I wish I didn't have. But we can control it. It doesn't scare me like it did when it first moved in. So, but I think what's important, and we'll cover this when we talk about tar, is it's really, really important that we control all the other diseases, okay? If tar moves in late and it's by itself, it doesn't bother me. I don't think it's yield limiting at all at that time. But if you get tar in combination with anything else, you could have a big problem on your hands, okay? Late to me is mid-August, okay? If you start to see tar show up at mid-August, I think, and it's just tar, you don't have a bunch of gray and a bunch of northern with it. Southern rust is a really bad companion. If you don't have those with it, I've never seen it wreak havoc with a yield or shut down the plant early or things like that we'll look at here in a minute. Okay, standability, I think, is the third thing that these fungicides are bringing. We talked about decreasing the stalk rots. That's going to help the standability. But just having green leaf surface so we can photosynthesize when we're filling the grain out. If we don't have enough leaf surface because of gray leaf, because of tar, whatever it is, then that plant's going to rob from the lower stalk and we're going to have standability issues, right? So we need to keep that plant healthy as late as we can. I had some experience with tar and southern rust in 2021. Pretty much got shell-shocked on it. I was prepared to do anything that it would take to control this. So Veltima is the fungicide that I use, and I'm not really pushing a fungicide. There's kind of a group of these longer residuals that I'll talk about. But I end up using a 10-ounce rate. Okay, I was going to use 7-ounce. I was going to use something early, do a split shot. The local BASF rep said, why don't you just use 10, put it on at R1, and that'll give you 60 days of residual. So I, was happy to do anything I could do. 60 days of residual, okay? So I was happy to try it after what I experienced in 2021, and, I like to try these things so I can talk about them with you and have actual real-world experience. So we put that on the 10th of July. These pictures were taken the 1st of October. There's some tar spot out here by this point in time, but 60 days afterwards, there was no tar. There was nothing. I did have a field of my son's across the road where he did put just a standard headline amp type treatment, standard in the past of what we would have used, and at that point in time, he had tar coming in. So it did what they said it would do. It was pretty incredible. But this is what we're after. We've got green leaf surface still. These stalks are still pretty green in the lower stalk. Okay, this is out in the middle of a 112-acre field. It's not the edges where we had a lot of sunlight coming in. These ears, I'm not giving credit to the fungicide for that. That's going to be our good emergence that we had this year, and we'll talk about that here in a couple of slides too. But this is kind of the list of these newer. Most of these have that SDHI, which gives them that longer residual. The Veltima itself is not an SDHI, okay? It has a triazole type product in there that has a real long residual. There is a Revitec, I guess, that's out now, which is basically Veltima with an SDHI in there with it. I'm not sure what the supply or anything of that is. I kind of just became aware of it. But this is, you can go online and look it up, RevX Fields. It's a BASF sponsored program. These are on-farm farmer trials, which is why I like them. Okay, real world, big, full field trials. And of course, everybody knows that they win their own trials. So in that fashion, the Veltima was the highest. But these 4 products here are pretty darn close. So there's your headline amp. That's your standard bearer for the old, the old normal 2 to 3 week type residual products. Great product. It's had a really great run. But we start to look at these longer residual products and we're seeing a good yield increase. And that's probably just because of the length of control we're having, keeping that plant greener longer for the photosynthesis. Your TrivaPro, I don't know why it's over here. I don't know, any particular reason, but that should be in there in the longer residual type products. So shifting gears then from the corn fungicides to the soybeans. So the first question is, do I need those long residual type products on my soybeans if I'm putting a fungicide on? Because the long residual is expensive. I think that was $45 an acre to put 10 ounces of Veltima on with an airplane. Paid for itself, but that's pretty expensive. What's your thoughts on the soybeans? When are we putting it on? It's R1 for corn. When is it for soybean? What's the magic date? R3, okay? When's R3 normally? Time of the year. End of July, absolutely. End of July, 1st of August, depending on the growing season. So my opinion is if we're putting a fungicide on at that time of the year on our soybeans, just for a disease control perspective, we'll get 2 to 3 weeks of residual. If I get 2 to 3 weeks of residual from the last week in July, first week in August, I'm good to go. There's nothing that's going to move in that late in the season that's going to hurt me disease-wise on soybeans, okay? So I don't think we really need those more expensive, longer residual type products. That's my opinion. Can supply with a ground sprayer, better coverage. If you need to throw an insecticide in there, my recommendation is a pyrethroid. There's always been a synergistic effect with the pyrethroid and the strobe. So that's just kind of an as needed. If you want to put a biological on, a micronutrient, it's going to be a great timing for that. So there's a lot of advantages by doing that application. But I think save your dollars and put them into that longer residual product on your corn. That's what I think. Okay, this is an example. This is my own farm again, Western Illinois, 10.5 ounces of Quilt XL. Put on at the R3 growth stage, which was 29th of July this year. Okay, so it just exactly what we just got done saying. If you've heard me speak before, you know that I'm pretty good a lot of times at not taking my own advice. Okay, so I should have been doing this before, but I've really drug my feet. I can be as cheap as anybody. But too many of you that I've talked to, farmers in my area that I've talked to, they just tell me that fungicides on soybeans pay every year. They just pay. Okay, so I had my local retailer come out here and he applied it on this side of the field, untreated over here then, and I just took my field view, made sure I got away from the end rows. 74 bushel on the untreated and 80 on the treated. So, I proved it to myself, and I'm going to be using a fungicide on my soybeans next year. Okay. All right, so we'll move in and talk a little bit about tar spot. These are slides I've used before. Okay, we've talked about this a lot in the past because it's the newest disease, but it can be very harmful. Okay, but I think I think we're learning a lot about it. I'm not going to say disinformation out of there, but I'll give you my opinion from what I've seen so far. But I'll be very, very honest with you that we're going to continue to learn with this disease. Okay, So we really need to keep our antenna up about it. But if we look at just the, just the identifying it, it's going to be those round, circular raised structures. It's really going to resemble road tar that might get on your vehicle. It really is. That's what it's going to look like. So the name is very, very fitting. May or may not be surrounded by that halo there. Okay, in South America, where tar came from, that was a background disease. And when those two were together, tar and that other disease, that was when we lost yield. Okay, so here, this is not a disease. Okay, and it doesn't always occur. I think it occurs more often when there's another disease on the plant with the tar. That's when I seem to see it more often. If it's just tar, a lot of times this is how you'll see it. But here you notice all this other background stuff, that's the southern rust. And when the southern rust was there, we started seeing more of this. When we see that background spot, we lose a lot of leaf surface, okay, which we need for the photosynthesis. All right. So here's some of the basic information that we know about tar and how it's going to move in and infect our fields. And this is the key, the one in red there. It's a little bit cooler season type of fungal disease. All right? So when we get into the heat of the summer, that's when we start seeing and worrying about gray leaf spot. Because gray's still our most prominent disease that we have every year. Gray likes warmer conditions. They all like wet. They're a fungus, so they all like wet. You got to have wet leaf surface. But gray likes it a little warmer. This milder temp, I think, is why we usually don't see tar until late in the season. Okay, we don't usually see it show up until mid-August. We need to be watching out for it, because it shows up early. That's when we get in trouble. But normally it sets in that mid-August to late August time frame. Got to have relative humidity, which we will have where we live, but it's got to have at least 7 hours of wetness too. So if we have a real dry August, even if it's a little cooler, we're not going to probably see it. But when these cool conditions occur, that mid-August time frame, that's when you start to see the dews and the fogs move in. So that's when we have that leaf wetness with those cooler conditions in August. So everything is just going to be ripe for this disease. Wind-driven rain spreads this disease, and obviously you have it out here. It started in Indiana and northern Illinois, and it's moved west. We usually have westerly, winds, so it has no problem moving, okay? And that's important too when we think about how am I going to control it. It does overwinter on the residue at the soil surface, so that's no different than gray leaf or northern.
Overwinters on the soil surface. What happens if we take it?
Sure, you'll move it. You'll move it to the next field.
It's possible to move from field to field by just spreading.
Oh yeah, on equipment, residue that's on other equipment. I mean, I wouldn't even get caught up in the spreading, because it's just going to spread. Yeah, there's nothing you're going to do to prevent it now. It's here. We've got it. It's probably going to be here forever. I see no reason why it would ever go away. Okay. Some years we won't have these conditions. The disease triangle. You got to have the host, which is corn, and you got to have the pathogen, which is the tar spot. But you always got to have that environment. Okay, so some years we won't have this. Some years gray's not bad. Some years northern's not bad. So we'll see some years way worse than others, but it's going to always be here now. I believe. No reason why it shouldn't be. Okay. So the damage is going to result in losing the green leaf tissue. But when this disease really, really has hammered us on yield, it shut that plant down early. Okay? And I mean, it'll be overnight when this happens. But I've never seen it with tar by itself. Okay? Tar always gets blamed because it's the new kid on the block. But when people send me pictures, or when I'm up looking at it, and this has happened like in that southern Wisconsin, northern Illinois, a couple different times now. But there's tar there on that leaf, but there's also gray, and there's also northern. There's that secondary disease, so I don't know why we give tar all the credit. It's the two diseases together that we really worry about, and they can shut that down. Now, we've seen that. You guys have seen that surely in your fields. I've had fields shut down early from gray leaf spot. it's got so bad that it's just shut that plant down before it's really truly finished out that grain fill period. And that's when we have stock rot issues because we've robbed the lower stock then, and it really takes out the yield because that corn didn't finish. You know, the test weights will be low, that type of thing. So that's what we're watching out for with tar, okay? As I mentioned, I don't think it's very yield limiting by itself. That's my opinion, okay? But I don't believe it is. I haven't seen it do that. But in combination with anything else, it's a problem. So management. So I've heard a lot about hybrid selection for this thing. And again, this is my opinion based on my experiences and what I look at. I don't think we're in a situation where I would even consider that as part of your management program right now, okay? I think a lot of that is marketing, okay? And even if there are differences now in certain hybrids, I don't think it's good enough to protect your yield, all right? These hybrids are still going to get tar spot. There's no resistance. There's starting to be some better tolerance in some of the newer hybrids that we looked at. 2 falls ago, I would say there wasn't anything that was good except for some real old genetics that we would have never looked at. The stuff that we looked at this fall, we were starting to see some separation. Okay, so potentially we could produce some stuff next year that I think would maybe start separating itself out in the field a little bit. But it's still not going to be resistance. It's still going to hit those hybrids as well, okay? So I just kind of hold back on that one. And the other thing is, you don't want us just to select a hybrid because it's got tar spot tolerance. If it's 20 bushel less, you know, you're not going to be happy. We're not going to be happy. It's still got to have the yield. It's still got to have all the other agronomic characteristics. 6812, which turned out to be an amazing yielding hybrid, and we couldn't produce it in the seed field. So we didn't, you know, we had a little bit this year that we used. But 2 years ago, I look back in my notes on this one because I remember 6812, them talking about that with tar spot. And the notes were that was a tar spot magnet for the genetic supplier that we got it from. Just got tar spot worse than anything else. And it was the highest yielding hybrid in their data set, okay? So it yielded in the face of having tar spot. And that's not uncommon either. We have hybrids that'll get gray really bad, but still yield in the face of that. So you know, it's not a science selecting for something like this. There's some art to it as well. But the fungicide application, I think, is our number one thing to manage tar spot, okay? So we got to either get ahead with a preventative, and it's going to need to be, I believe it needs to be a long residual preventative, or you need to be prepared maybe to spray twice. Maybe we spray it R1 and we spray again in August, okay? Your scouting, though, is the big thing. This is the take-home message for tar spot. It used to be when we would go out there and we would scout these fields right ahead of tasseling. Pollen hadn't started dropping yet. It was livable to be out there, right? All right, and we're looking, you know, we had thresholds on gray leaf spot and we were making sure there weren't other diseases out there. And then we were just done. You know, we were pretty well done from a fungicide perspective. Maybe we were looking for insects later on. Tar spot changes all that. We are going to need to be out here looking for foliar diseases later on in the summer than we've ever done in the past. So maybe we're out there at R1 or right before R1, right before tasseling, and then maybe we're out there again in late July and then again in mid-August, or maybe it's 3 or 4 trips. But we can't just be out there right ahead of tasseling and then be done for the year anymore. That's the big change, because we've got to catch tar early, and we've got to catch that companion disease early with it. And even if we put on a long residual, we got to make sure they're still holding, okay? So that's the take-home message of what I think you need to do, and I think you'll be fine with this disease. Residue management. That's another one we hear a lot. Okay, it's overwintering on the residue, so how do we manage that? What's your thoughts on that? You're going to be able to do much for this disease with residue management? How many moldboard plowers in the room? Okay. You guys can control it in that field, because the only way to control something that's living on the residue is completely bury it, which you can with a moldboard, right? And then your neighbor's field right next to you, it'll blow right in there, okay? So even a moldboard plow is not going to be the answer to this. It moves really easily. So I think, you know, that's interesting to talk about, but I don't think it's really realistic. So back to kind of review, we looked at the tar spot and when it'll come in, but this is kind of the overall sheet here to compare everything. So here's your hot weather stuff right here, okay? And remember, the rusts don't overwinter up here. They're a fungus, but they have to blow in from the south. They won't overwinter in our cold winters. So last year when we had southern rust really bad, we had a lot of storms that originated out of the Gulf. And so this year, every storm we had this year, first thing I did was get on the radar and saw where that storm was coming from. Because I mean, I just got annihilated by southern rust last year. Everything this year came from the Pacific. There was hardly any storms that came up from the Gulf at all. We had almost no rust. I think I saw a couple of fields, maybe one or two pustules. So that was a good thing, and that's back to the environment there with the disease triangle. But these two guys, we can scout for these early and get these controlled at that R1 stage. And then these here, you know, we see common rust in northern. A lot of times we'll see them early in the season. And again, they're those cooler conditions. So they may set in early on, and we should be able to control them then when we do that R1 application. But we did see, like northern, we saw it move in late this year. You know, that's why when it cooled down, it kind of started to take off again. But then there's your tar going to set there, and most years start coming in maybe that mid-August time frame. All right, so we got to get these controlled. We got to be scouting and have a good preventative out there. So I'll just a little picture story of why this is all important, what we've just talked about, and why you need to control tar and control these other diseases with it. So this is what we got me going in 2021. That's where I was born and raised, right there where my mom lives. 27th of July. I think that's when the tar set in, okay? It came in a little early in 2021, right? So it's why we got to be out there scouting to catch that. So these are field health maps from Field View. 20 days later, 10 days after that, 10 days after that. That's what that field looked like. That's your shutting down prematurely, and that's your probably 50 bushel yield loss right there. All right. This look right here is probably what we should normally see on the 5th of September. You know, that field should be mostly green yet, just kind of starting to turn good. So you can see how rapidly that happened. 1 mile north of here is University of Illinois Research Farm, Northwest Illinois. I don't know why it's northwest because it's central, but that's what they call it. It is Illinois after all. So here's where I saw the Veltima, 7 ounces. That's your standard rate, and they're claiming 45 days on that. That might be long enough. Okay, if I put that on July the 10th and I got 45 days out of it, that might get me where I needed to be. But I'm probably going to still use the 10 ounces with the results I saw. Okay. Anybody have burr cucumber in the room? Decide whether I need to talk about it or not. You heard it yesterday. You got some burr cucumber. Okay, we'll hit this real quick. This was a suggestion, a request that I cover this a little bit, particularly in eastern Iowa, western Illinois. It's been a problem for a while. I've dealt with this in the river bottoms there across from Burlington, from the year 2000 on probably with customers. And it can be a big problem. So it's going to be a vine, okay? So like the morning glories, but it's a bigger, badder version, okay? It's going to have these heart-shaped leaves here. The vines can be up to 20 feet long. It's a very large seed, okay? So large seeds will come from a pretty good depth, and it can germinate from 6 inches deep. Okay, so if there's a management decision, if this weed becomes a problem for you, you just think about no-till. You probably have fewer flushes in no-till if that fits what your program, what you're doing. I'm not recommending getting away from tillage, But maybe if you're no-tilling your soybeans, that flush is probably going to happen pretty early on. You're not going to have those later flushes from deep in the soil. It's not a prolific seed producer, so over time you can get on top of it a bit. But this is what it'll look like in corn. This is why we're talking about it, because it can be really bad. All right, and it could weight this corn completely down. And if you got it that bad, you gonna be able to get it through the combine, James? You might as well leave it, because you ain't getting it through the combine. And when it piles up on the head there, you better have a pitchfork, because it's very spiny. Okay, I mean it's not. And James Cornelius said the other day, and then after that, you better just throw your clothes away, because you ain't getting those spines out of it. So it's a nasty weed. So we'll talk a little bit about, there's really some pretty good chemicals to control it. We're able to control it pretty good in one of the fields that we have with it. But on the soybean side, these are your trade names here of the products that are pretty decent on it on residual. You want to hit it with a 2-pass, particularly with those multiple flushes that it might have. And then on the post side here, so classic, that's your chlorimiron. If you guys remember back in the early 90s, you would have used some classic on soybeans or some synchrony. And then Roundup is pretty decent on it, and Liberty as well. But if you got a real big problem, you might want to tank mix a couple of these together. I don't have as good a luck with 2,4-D as you normally do on vines. So I sprayed around the outside after brown silk. Normally with a Morning Glory, they'd be wilted before you got around the whole field, and it's survived it. So I don't think 2,4-D is the greatest answer. So probably in a dicamba 2,4-D type program, you want to make sure you do have it tank mixed with the Roundup and the Liberty. I think you'll be in pretty good shape. On the corn side, the good old atrazine is pretty decent on it. The bleachers, like the Callisto type products, they're pretty good on it. They're good on residual and on contact control of it. So we've got a pretty good list here. And then on the post side, you do want to get it when it's less than 12 inches, just like any vine, before it really starts running, is when you want to get that sprayed. Much easier to control at that point in time. And then pretty good list of products that you can stick in here. So my program has probably been the Acuron, Roundup, and Callisto. And I've had pretty good luck in controlling it. But there's your list there, what you can use. Okay, so corn emergence. Wanted to hit on this a little bit again. We've talked about these slide, both corn and soybean planting dates, in a lot of different talks that we've had. But it really relates back to this year, and I think what we saw with a lot of our good yields in corn. And this really is your watch out here. So you got to remember, when we all know about the late planting, okay, and what that does to our yield in corn, but we can get dinged on that front side of the corn planting too. That's why we always talk about, you got making sure that soil temperature is warm enough. We like it to be 50 degrees and warming would be our preference. Cool, wet soils can really ding us. Soybeans, not so much. This is going to be flat for soybeans. That's why on the early planted soybeans, me personally, I like that program, because when I can't stand it not to be out in the field, it might be a little too cold, I can plant beans and keep myself from planting corn. All right. But in 2022, where we had big yields, I think it started with our emergence. Our emergence was really, really good in most places. I understand there's places that it weren't, and we might have got dinged here. But you think about, what does that do for us? I mean, a lot of areas we weren't able to start until at least May. A lot of places it was the second week in May, but we were warmer by that time. Okay, so we didn't have the cold shock. We just didn't have cold injury to the extent we normally do, and we weren't sitting there in cold soils and soaking up those soil-borne fungal diseases. And Pythium is the big one, right? We added Viantis to our seed treatments to control Pythium, and there's a reason, because Pythium has really dinged us on yield a lot in the past. And it'll do that by injuring that plant right at emergence. So it's going to injure that root system, and a lot of times those are going to be our plants that have crown rot later on in the season. They give us standability issues, because crown rot, that's an infection that comes in right at emergence. It's in that plant all year, and then we actually really see it, kill that plant right at the end of the season. It's also just going to give us more plants with ears, and they're going to be more consistent ears with this really good emergence and not getting dinged by those soil-borne fungal diseases. All right, so it's just a reminder that next year, the importance of having that good emergence and what it did for our yields, maybe to keep us out of that field for a day or two when we shouldn't be in there. I showed you that picture. I told you this is when it happened. Those ears where every plant had an ear and they were all consistent and they were all big. This is why it happened, because our emergence was so good. Corn is not like beans. It will not compensate like a bean will. We have proven that we can frost off a bean on Memorial Day weekend, like we did 2 years ago, and we can shoot axillary buds out from the cotyledon node and have almost 100% yield potential. You don't do that in corn. All right, you screw corn up and you'll pay for it all year. So we worry about emergence. We worry about V5 when we're doing rows around, V12 when we're doing length of the row. We worry about when we're pollinating in that early grain fill and then finishing that plant out. Okay, so the message there is just choose your planting date wisely. And don't err on the backside either. I'm not saying it's an easy decision. Obviously, there's times when we really just got to go when the calendar says it. But be careful on that front end. Okay, we'll have a little fun exercise here. See if you guys can tell me what went wrong here in these two fields. 190 bushel up here, 262 bushel right there. So before I start getting into other slides, to give you some hints here, what potentially could give that much yield difference? Same year, same area. Both fields had 10 ounces of Veltima. Very, very good point though. Fertility. Harvestable ears. Excellent point. What else? Hybrid. Excellent. What else? Foliar feeding. Planting date. Planting date was different. What else? I'm looking for one more. Rain. Good one. Crop rotation. Corn on corn versus corn on beans. Treatment. Okay, let's dig into it a little bit. So first of all, here's where these two fields sit. That is less than 4 football fields away. Okay, so we're pretty darn close. This is probably better soil type than this in general. They both had hog manure on them. They both got pretty good fertility. That is 17th year corn versus first year corn. So that takes out the rotation issue. Normally we expect the lower yielding to be in the continuous corn. Hybrid was mentioned. This is a very good hybrid. This hybrid was absolute king down there in my area this year. Just blew the doors off of everything, okay? So it's not a hybrid issue. All right, here's your next hint. See if you can pick it out. Field health maps. So we do see end of August. It's still pretty green in the middle. This one's starting to suffer pretty good. What do you see on here? 10 inches less rain, less than 4 football fields apart, okay? It was a micro drought for sure. It's hard to believe you could have that much less rain. And I pull into this field. The first thing I'm doing is what I usually do in a situation like this, I call myself a dumbass, okay? I'm like, dumbass, what did you do? How did you screw this up? What did I do? You're sick when you pull in the field. Like, yields are 230s to 250s, and this field should have been great. I had hog manure on it. So I'm just pulling my hair out. So we didn't finish the field, went home at night, and then that's when I dug into it a little more. I got my field view out, and I looked at the rainfall, and I looked at the yearly totals on, you've got to be kidding me. 10 inches less rain. So dig into it a little bit further. When did it occur? So there's 10 inches more at the end of August, 10 inches more at the end of July, same thing end of June, end of May, you're starting to see a little bit more, but still 11 inches. It's subsoil moisture. Before I even planted this field, it was 10 inches deficient versus the other one. So it was deficient all year long. We had good weather this year, but we saw, especially like in our soybeans, the wettest area of fields were the highest yielding, areas that are always less yielding because they're too wet. So we were just fed all year long. We didn't have really any excess to draw on. So in that kind of a situation where I started out with less moisture, then it paid all year long. Or I paid for it all year long in this field. Years were just smaller. I mean, they filled out okay. They weren't spongy or anything, but it was really interesting. So it's neat with these yield maps, what we can kind of learn. You know, I'm not sure. I mean, we always talk about learning something from it. There's nothing I could have done. I mean, made me feel better, I guess. Didn't have the bushels. But so I dig into it a little bit more, though. 7366 is a drought guard hybrid, but we know it doesn't have overly good drought tolerance, okay? We felt like that the drought guard just make it good enough that we could, you know, use the hybrid in most situations, but be a little careful with it. But in a droughty situation versus a really tough hybrid here, held up really well. So that's really the only take home that I could kind of pull out of that. But there's always something that we can learn. And it's interesting to be able to do that. So a couple more slides just on a couple issues that were recommended we talk about. Harvest loss, all right? So as soon as it'll fit your budget, my recommendation is you get a draper head for the soybeans and the harvest loss. It's a real thing. Drapers are not cheap, but they do a very good job of reducing that shatter. And you see a lot of these draper heads that even have the blowers that blow the beans back in that still the reel, you know, maybe knocking off, okay? So I think that's the best recommendation. On the corn side, I think we need to be harvesting our corn earlier if you're not already, okay? And that's to get away from the shatter loss that we're going to get eventually if that corn's drying down. Now, most of us will get started in corn, and then when the soybeans are ready, we're switching to soybeans, and we need to. We got to get the beans out, right, because of the weather. Then when we get back in corn's going to be pretty dry.
You want it to dry down, not die down.
That's correct. And I don't want to, if I can see shatter at the corn head while I'm harvesting, that's a sick feeling, all right? And, you know, some hybrids maybe shatter worse than others. Some years they shatter worse than others, but you're going to have shatter when that corn gets too dry. That's a management decision we can make. I know we have to pay money for, you know, to dry it down further, but I think we'll more than make up that money by reducing that shatter. We talk about phantom yield loss. Maybe there is a phantom yield loss, the difference in the shrink at the elevator versus letting it dry down in the field. But how much of that phantom yield loss is really just shatter that we're seeing at the head? Okay, P&K is expensive, right? Like outrageously expensive, like frustratingly expensive, whatever you want to call it. Sometimes when it gets up that high, we might skip a year. Done that forever. If our fertility is pretty good, we kind of draw on the bank a little bit. Okay. Variable rate, I think, is the best use of your dollars. When it gets really high and you need to be really careful of what you're spending on P&K, if you're using variable rate, you know, you can take those areas that are really high and you can just completely skip that and focus on those low areas and try to bring those up and still increase your yield. But I think you need to figure out what you can afford to put on P&K even in this kind of environment. And of course, we had yields in a lot of places and price in a lot of places that allow us to have, you know, some money to put back in that. But we don't want to skip too many years even under this kind of environment because we don't know what's going to come back down. Historically, you know, it's up and down, but these prices may stay high for 3, 4, 5 years.
If you're taking it out, you need to put it back.
Yep, because the expense of getting it built back up, if you let it go down, is, you know, that's when it's cost prohibitive. So, you know, I skipped last year. My fertilizer guy, by the time we got ready to sit down and do it, he's like, I'm not going to blame me. He said I'd skip a year, but I'm not going to skip any more. We've got to keep adding it, okay? Because we don't know how long this is going to take. Okay, that's all I had. Are there any other additional questions?
The Cornelius Seed families wish you and your family a very Merry Christmas. Take time to laugh, love, and enjoy each other this holiday season. Cornelius Seed, plant it, profit.